if they get into the lift line and they hear the people behind them laughing at them and calling them, oh, she's a Jerry, he's Jerry, like, look at that guy skiing in jeans, what a loser. It's not going to encourage them to embrace the outdoors. It's going to push them farther away. And I think that's dangerous because, like you guys have talked about, we know the benefits that being outside can have on your mental health and wellness. So when we push people away by having those kind of judgmental, classist attitudes, it can really be hurtful.
Hey friends, welcome back to A Different Perspective. In today's episode, Davin and I will be interviewing Madeleine French. She's an avid backpacker and a dietitian, and she's putting her knowledge of nutrition and the outdoors together to provide a unique perspective on fueling and dining deep in the outdoors. Hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Well, welcome everyone. We have our next guest on A Different Perspective. Her name's Madeleine French, and she has a master's degree in nutrition. She's an avid backpacker and currently works as a clinical dietitian. We're super excited to hear her perspective on nutrition and outdoor recreation. Maddie, thanks for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and maybe how you got into the outdoors and backpacking?
Yeah, great question. So I moved to Utah in 2017, and that's when I really started to get into camping and backpacking. I grew up in Western Michigan, and I went to the University of Vermont for my undergrad. And I don't know if you guys have been to those places, but there's a lot of mosquitoes and it rains a ton in both those spots. So I didn't really get into backpacking or camping until I moved here. When I was a sophomore at the University of Vermont, I came out for spring break to visit some of my friends who were living in Salt Lake at the time. And they took me to Moab, and I was blown away by the landscape, the rocks, the desert. I just didn't know that kind of terrain existed in the United States. Coming from the Midwest, it was like serious. It was such a shock. And I just knew I'd fallen in love, and I wanted to move after I graduated. So I really moved here for the outdoor recreation. A lot of people, I think, assume that I moved here for the graduate program. I just completed the graduate program at the University of Utah. So like Davin mentioned, I have a master's in nutrition. And a lot of people think that I moved here for that. And they always kind of laugh when I correct them and say, no, I really just moved here to ski. And the master's program was kind of like a cherry on top. So yeah, so do you guys have experience backpacking or camping?
A little bit, yeah. I did a lot of backpacking and camping when I lived in Flagstaff, actually, where Davin and I met, and just had a bunch of buddies who were doing mountaineer classes. They were in forestry classes, so they were always outdoors. And Flagstaff is right in the dead center of this massive forest, so we would always go out there. That's the large amount of backpacking experience, but I've done a few backpacking trips and such in the meantime through Sedona, and we just went up to Colorado for a little bit, kind of hiked around in the Rockies, so that was a good time. So
nice, that's awesome. What about you, Davin?
Most of my experiences are more in the realm of car camping. I think just being from Hawaii, we don't like cold weather, and most places out here at night it'll drop super low relative to my liking. But back home, most of us just kind of camp on the beach. That's kind of the move. Not so much in the mountains because it rains a lot or there's rivers and things like that. But like you mentioned, like different terrains. I was just out in Missouri and North Carolina, and as you go Midwest to East Coast, like super different terrains, and there's lots of things to consider whether you want to camp at all or backpack and things like that.
Yeah, totally. That's awesome. I think I've never I've done so much backpacking out here, never anywhere on a beach. So that sounds so cool to me. So interesting. Not what I think of when I think of like camping.
Yeah.
Cool.
Maddie, you mentioned, I heard Midwest, I heard Vermont, and then I heard you're in Utah now. So you were born in the Midwest?
Yes, I was born in Michigan, went to school at the University of Vermont for my undergrad, and then came here in 2017. So I've been living here for 3 years, and I think I'll stay here. I totally love Utah.
Yeah,
I really like it.
Gorgeous. So what was your very first backpacking trip? No, you already mentioned that. What was what was that backpacking trip involved? You said it was through the Trek program, right?
Yeah, so the first backpacking trip I ever went on was, it was like pre-orientation for my freshman year at the University of Vermont. So they had an option, you could come to school early and do a backpacking trip. And, you know, I thought, okay, that'd be a good way to make friends and meet people and kind of get used to, you know, the new place I was gonna be living in. So I decided to do that, and it was really fun. It was the first time I ever had a backpack, you know, a big backpacking backpack on. And I was shocked at how heavy it was. And now I go backpacking and I'm like, oh, it's just my backpack. Like, it's not horrible. But those first couple of days were like painful. Like, I think we only did 4 miles, and I was shocked. Like, I thought we had walked for like 10 miles. Like, if you would have asked me at the end of that first day on that trip, like, how many miles do you think you went today? I would have definitely said like 15 at least. Like, it's hard getting into backpacking. It's not always like physically comfortable. Like, your body hurts a lot of the time. So, but altogether, it was a really great trip. We did 5 days in the Green Mountains in Vermont. We had a little bit of rain. We didn't use tents, which was interesting. We made tarp shelters, like lean-tos. And that was pretty much just to save on space in our backpacks. So it was me and about maybe like 8 other freshmen, and then we had 2 leaders. And we all slept under a big tarp. So it was a really great way to like introduce me to Vermont, and just to kind of get a sense for like, okay, I'm in a new part of the country. Like, this is what it looks like around me. So that was a really, really positive experience, but not the whole time. Definitely some getting used to.
That's great. So I have one other question. So when I've been backpacking, I go through periods of where I have the weight and I shift it up onto my shoulders in different ways, and then I slack it and kind of like lean forward and just kind of counterbalance. Is there an optimal backpacking, like the way that you pack your backpack and the way that you walk with it? Is there like an optimal technique for that?
I believe so. And I kind of think it's a little different for everyone. So like, women have wider hips. So a lot of the time, like, women, it's can be a lot more comfortable for us to have a lot more weight in our, like, on our hip strap.
Mm-hmm.
So for me personally, I always tighten the hip strap really tight. Whereas some of the guys I know, they just like, they're like, oh, it's so uncomfortable having that hip strap. They like to have it more in their shoulders. So I think it kind of depends. It goes from person to person. Like, if you should have your weight like in the, like, up top or kind of down bottom. Typically when I'm packing my backpack, I've always operated under the assumption that you would put the heaviest stuff at the bottom of the pack. And then last weekend, I was backpacking with someone who is from Utah, a lot of experience, and they were like, oh no, you put the heaviest stuff on the top. Yeah. And so that just kind of blew my mind. So I don't even know how to answer your question, because now I'm just second guessing myself. But personally, I put the heaviest stuff in the bottom, and I always make sure that I have the hip strap pretty tight. So that's just what I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever I've been backpacking, we always pack inverted like that, where we put the heaviest stuff on the top, at least with the way that our backpacks were constructed, because it loads up onto our shoulders better versus like having to fight against that.
Yeah. It's like kind of can pull you back.
Yeah. But yeah. I'm also a little top heavy. So for me, that kind of is a double whammy.
Well, maybe I've just been doing it wrong this whole time.
Oh, no, like you said, I don't know that there's anything wrong about it. It's just, yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, definitely up to personal preference.
Do you think that's like a regional thing in the way maybe people's philosophies are different about backpacking? Like when you're in Vermont, like, hey, this is the way we do it. We plan it this many weeks out, versus Utah. I don't know, maybe people shotgun it. They're like, hey, let's do it. And they kind of jump at the gun. Do you see any regional differences in your experience?
That could be why, like, because when I learned how to pack, all the heavy stuff at the bottom, it was definitely in Vermont is where I learned that. People were like, always pack your heaviest stuff on the bottom. It's better for your back. I would say like the biggest differences are going to be like the types of camping and the types of excursions that you can go on. So like in Utah, you see, there's a lot of like desert camping. There's a lot of slot canyons. There's a lot of just kind of summiting peaks, that kind of stuff. Whereas the East Coast is a lot more like you're in woods, you're in forests. There's typically so much more water. water is a big concern when you're backpacking in Utah. Like, is there going to be water? There's certain places that you just can't access in the summer because the creek beds dried up and there's no way for you to access water. Whereas on the East Coast, you really don't have to worry about that. There's pretty much streams, rivers, lakes all over the place. So I think there's definitely some really big differences between like the types of camping and the types of like trips that people go on from one coast to the other. So, and like you mentioned Hawaii too, like that never even occurred to me. You know what I mean? Like that you could camp on a beach, like that's a great example of another just very like culturally, and as far as the weather goes, it's going to determine the kind of trip that you can have. So
was that learning curve for you to figure out like, oh, we can't do these particular trips during this part of the year for these reasons? Was that a steep learning curve, or what was the research like? Was it just talking to people who are experienced, or are there places you can find this kind of information?
Yeah, you can definitely find a lot of information on different people's like travel blogs. You can find a lot of information on like all trails. People will comment like, you know, did this backpacking trip or did this trail and the creeks dried up. Also just talking to people who are more experienced and who have lived here for longer than myself has been a really good tool for me. Like asking, hey, have you done this? You know, have you gone to this spot in this, you know, in this month? Because it changes month to month, like if you can go or if you can't. So yeah, I think definitely utilizing like online resources as well as like just actually trying to get to talk to people. And if you're like new to the area, go to REI and talk to the people at REI because they're total experts in the area, especially. And they're happy to talk to people about trips. I've found
Totally. It sounds like the community, at least outdoor community, super tight knit, and really friendly. Kind of a follow up to that. Have you noticed any differences from where you've been in like maybe outdoor etiquette? Just being from Hawaii, when I'm at the beach there and I'm at the beach at the East Coast or the West Coast, the etiquette's a lot different. Have you noticed any differences between the places you've lived?
That is such a good question. Yes.
I'm grinding someone's gears here. Someone's gonna get offended by maybe.
Yeah. So I'm like, you know, the only like experience that I had when I was little, like camping in Michigan, and I don't want to put all Michiganders in the same boat, but we don't have mountains there. So like, we're not doing that kind of camping. To me, it seemed a lot more like people were like you would get your RV, you know, and you would drive to, you know, the lake shore to an RV park where there would be, you know, a little grill that you could do charcoal and you do brats and burgers. And that was like, you know, that for me growing up, that was really the only like camping I experienced. Whereas I came to Utah and I was talking to people and they're like, oh yeah, you know, I went camping, you know, I went backpacking as soon as I could walk. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So it definitely seems like there's a very big shift. Like, whereas Michigan is definitely seemingly, at least in my experience, granted I'm from a city, but a little bit more like reserved. Whereas like people like in Utah seem like they're kind of doing some crazier, more backcountry, like farther away from civilization, more primitive camping, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think there is a big difference, like from where you are, what camping looks like to different people. And it's totally like, it's, you know, it's a sliding scale. Like camping to someone, you know, is putting a tent in your backyard, you know, and watching a movie in your tent. Like, and camping to other people is like, oh, you have to be, you know, so many miles away from civilization and you have to be the only one out there and it has to be cold and hard. So I think it's a continuum, but that's a really interesting question.
So on that continuum, where is your favorite spot? Like, not necessarily comfortable, but like where do you like to be on that continuum?
I really love I love me some car camping, and I also really like to go super far out in the middle of nowhere and be just like alone, you know, with, you know, the couple people that I'm hiking with, and to really feel that kind of like solitude. Because living in Salt Lake City, you know, I'm looking at all my neighbors right now, you know, I see a bunch of them walking by. You just see people all the time, and that's great. But it's really nice to just feel like, you know, you're kind of alone in nature, and to feel that kind of solitude every once in a while is really refreshing and relaxing to me. But I also really like to just kind of take like the easy route and, you know, pull your car up next to a river, you know, and kind of just have your cooler, not have to like work super hard, not really plan a lot of like big treks, kind of more do like day hikes from the spot. Like, for instance, my family from Michigan came out and visited me, and we went to Zion and we camped in their campsite. So there's bathrooms there. They have a shuttle. Like, you don't have to walk to the trailhead, like you take a bus. So like, that's like luxury to me. And that's really fun and nice every once in a while. And it makes it more accessible for more people, which I'm all about. So I think that's important. So, yeah.
So one thing that we're really excited to hear about is your nutritional experience with all of this. So I know you have some caveats, but I'd love to hear about what your perspective is on the way that people need to pack for backpacking, because it's not something that like immediately stands out as like, oh yeah, I mean, I'm going to be away from immediate access food for 3 or 4 days. So how do you like to pack for food? You know, do you cook for yourself? Do you bring your own dried meals? You know, things like that. I'd love to hear that.
Totally. So my philosophy as a dietitian is to mostly eat whole foods and to cook your own meals from scratch. I use the hyphenate, you know, I hyphenate from scratch because am I at home making my own pasta to bring on my camping trip? Heck no. I'm going to buy the boxed pasta. But just cooking things for yourself, not eating a lot of pre-prepared stuff, in my experience, you know, is just the healthier way to go. So I try to bring that into the backcountry with me. So there's a lot of considerations when you're planning for a backpacking trip, and things that we really just take for granted, like, you know, our refrigerators, our pantries, you know, the fact that in a city I can get potable water just right out of my faucet. Those are things that you can't, you know, take for granted in the backcountry, and that you really need to like think about and plan for. So first step when I know I'm going to go on like a backpacking or a camping trip is I'll just get a piece of paper out, and I will like just write down, I will plan out every single meal, and then a couple like general snacks that I'm going to have for the trip, so that I make sure when I get there, I know, okay, I brought all this stuff. I know like that I have enough to eat. So like one of the, you know, big considerations is food safety, of course, because we don't have, you know, unless you're car camping and you have your cooler, if you're backpacking, you don't have a way to make sure that your food's refrigerated. So you can't bring any food that should be refrigerated or frozen. And then also water safety is another thing. You know, do you have either enough water to last you the whole time that you're going to be on your trip, or do you have a way to, you know, pump and filtrate clean water from a stream or a body of water? Another thing that we have to really think about when you're packing your food is going to be weight and packability. So when I say packability, I mean, like, think about foods that you would not hesitate to just like throw in a backpack and be like, it's going to be good, versus things like bananas, peaches, pears, things that are going to get totally crushed. Like, you do not, I've brought bananas backpacking. It's a bad idea. Just take my word for it. Don't do it. It doesn't work well.
I brought, sorry to interrupt. It totally reminds me of something super gross. We found, or we had a peach that I brought with me on it was like an overnight backpacking trip, and I never ate this peach, and like I ended up putting my backpack away, and then like 2 months later I come back to my backpack, and it's just this rotted mess.
Yeah.
Like the skeleton of this peach left in there. It's just so gross. And I'm like, okay. Yeah, it took me like a week to clean up that
yeah. So it's important to bring foods that aren't gonna like totally just explode all over your backpack. Like, and so thinking about an apple versus a banana, you know, you would choose the apple. But then another consideration, like I mentioned, was weight. So are you going to bring a Honeycrisp? Because those can be 3 pounds. Or, you know, are you going to opt for something like a Gala apple or just a smaller apple so that it doesn't take up as much weight on your shoulders. And then another big consideration is cooking equipment, and that really kind of determines what you can make and what you can't. If you have a jet boil, which is pretty much just a small stove and a large cup, that, like the name infers, it boils water really quickly. You could definitely make, like, instant oatmeal in there. But it's really hard to saute vegetables. It's hard to cook pretty much anything that isn't like completely water based. You could make coffee, instant oatmeal, that's kind of it. So like personally, I have a little stove with a little skillet and a pot. So I'm able to make a lot more things because I have kind of extensive camping cooking equipment, so that I can make those kind of like fancier meals that are going to require more kind of home cooking than, say, just pouring some like boiling water into one of those freeze-dried food bags and calling it good. So those are some of the kind of main considerations that I take into account when I'm prepping or when I'm helping other people prep for their trips.
Okay. Follow-up question to that. Do you typically have like a set type of set foods that you always bring, like a set amount, or do you kind of adjust for the expected intensity? Like, a 4-day trip might be a 4-day trip, but if you're peaking 2 or 3 times within that trip, or if it's just more of a kind of a walk, do you adjust for the intensity, or do you typically bring the same amount of food?
So I think that's a really good question. So it depends, like typically the more days that you're going to be out, the lighter the food you need to bring. Because if I were to go on an overnight backpacking trip, usually I'll make a more like extensive kind of elaborate meal that might have more ingredients. If I'm doing a 4-day backpacking trip, you have to think that you're carrying that, your dinner for night 4, you're carrying with you day 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you really have to think about, like, okay, how hard is the trip I'm about to do? Are we going to be, like you said, summiting with our packs on or with our packs off? If I were to be prepping for a trip that was going to be super intense and more than 3 days, I would probably do kind of more of like a bare bones type like diet plan, just because you really don't want to be packing all that weight with you if you're going to be doing a really intense hike. And that being said, when you're doing more intense hikes, you have to have more calories. So really like looking at how can I get the most calories in the smallest package? So that can definitely be a challenge. And there's, I think, a tipping point where you want to make sure that you have enough food, but you also want to make sure that you can carry it. And that's why going backpacking with friends always helps, because you can divide the weight between the packs. So I found that when I've been carrying all my own stuff, or when I've only gone with like one other person, it always feels a lot heavier. And I feel like I can't bring as much, like as many toppings or as many extra vegetables, so those are all like definitely things to consider.
Tell me about maybe a con of having too many people in a group, especially if you're doing multi-days. I mean, you mentioned a really good pro about it, but maybe some things people might not know off the top of their head. They want to invite all their friends to do a backpacking trip. Like, what's a limit for you personally? And then generally, like, when after this point it becomes too much people?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I've been in those situations where, it's like Labor Day weekend and you're going to go to, Wall Lake, which is only, maybe less than 2-mile hike. And all of a sudden you have 40 people are at your campsite. 40 people have come and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. I feel like it kind of depends what kind of trip you're doing. A long, extensive backpacking trip, you're going to want to, like, you don't want too many people because you have to stop to go to the bathroom. People might be on different snack schedules. But it's really like up to, what's the kind of like goal of the mission? Like, is the goal of the mission to go out and have fun with your friends? Invite whoever you want. Like, is the goal of the mission to summit Kings Peak in one day? and you're going to be trail running, like maybe just go by yourself or with one other running partner. So I think it totally depends on the situation, but you know, typically with more people, there's going to be more bumps in the road. There's going to be like more things that you have to wait for. And then always just make sure to like communicate with the people that you're going with, you know, this is the intensity level, you know, this is the number of miles we're going to be doing in one day. And if that's, you know, too much for you, maybe we can, you know, schedule a different camping trip that you'd be comfortable on. Because what you don't want is to have, you know, a friend come who's kind of new to the sport and, you know, maybe injure themselves because they're not prepared. Like I went camping with some friends from out of town, and they didn't, I didn't communicate how cold it got in the desert at night. And so they get down there and they didn't even have sleeping bags. I mean, that's like,
Wow.
That's dangerous. They didn't have a good time. You know, we gave them all our clothes, like, here's my extra hat, like, here's my extra pants, like, wrap yourselves in this. But, you know, you have to make sure that the people you're going with, like, know what to expect. So I always feel like there's a responsibility for the kind of the leader of the group. Make sure that the people you're going with are informed and like ready for the trip that you're about to do, just so that, you know, you don't have any sort of like, you know, unsafe sort of situations. So.
Yeah, speaking to that from my own experience, I've had a scenario like that where I was just underprepared. The weather had changed so drastically where we were camping in southern Utah, and I guess we didn't over prepare. And I think when you have a car, you have that ability to over prepare with equipment. Yeah. So also maybe telling people, here's what could go wrong. It might not go wrong, but just in case, like, you're prepared mentally for it.
Yeah, I think it's always better to pack too much to an extent, you know what I mean? Like, you don't want to be so weighed down by your pack that you can hardly move. But, you know, even if it doesn't say it's going to rain and you're going to the desert, bring a raincoat, like, bring your rain cover for your backpack. You don't want to be in a situation where, you know, the weather changes like it does so often in the desert. It can change in 5 minutes. You don't want to be in a situation where you find yourself woefully unprepared. And it can be dangerous if you're not prepared in the sense that you don't have enough food or water. That can turn into like a life-threatening medical emergency. And when you're in the backcountry, you know, without like access to medical attention, it can be really scary. So always being prepared, maybe like leaning on the edge of over prepared, I think is always good. Yeah.
So when you're on these trips, do you always try to stick to I'm trying to figure out a better way to phrase this question. I mean, have you heard of Leave No Trace?
Yes.
So how much of Leave No Trace do you pay attention to? Like, is there like, there's no way that I'll be able to do this on a backpacking trip for certain things, like when you're camping, making a fire, or do you try to adhere to that as much as possible? Like, are there situations where you can't adhere to Leave No Trace?
Good question. So I try to adhere to that pretty strictly with, you know, so I've been on a trip where a friend was like, we had brought a can of beans with us, and he was like, we can't pour out, you know, the water in the can of beans, like the gray water. He's like, we have to drink it. And I was like, oh, I haven't taken it that far. Like, that was a little, we totally made fun of him after that. We're like, dude, you're going way too overboard on this Leave No Trace thing. But I think it's really important. Like, I do not throw, you know, orange peels. I don't throw apple peels. I eat the whole apple core. That's totally a weird thing that I do. But when you're camping, like, just eat the whole core. Like, it's, you know, there's some good probiotic bacteria in the seeds and in the core. It's just more fiber. Like, what's wrong with that, right? Or obviously bring a trash with you if you don't want to eat the orange peel or whatever. I don't eat the orange peel. I just eat the apple core. I'm not that weird, I swear. But I mean, I pack out my toilet paper. Like, I don't leave my toilet paper in the ground. I think that's wrong to assume that it's just gonna, you know, decompose. Try to make things look like they did when you got there. So if it's not fire season and we built a fire pit with rocks, we'll deconstruct the rocks, we'll move the rocks away from the fire pit and try to spread out the ashes after they're cold, of course, so that it looks like we weren't there. I think it's really important to try to leave no trace if possible. I think there's very few situations in which it would be like truly impossible to adhere to that kind of rule. So I think it's always best to like lean on the side of caution, and just, if you're thinking, oh, is this going to decompose? Just put it in your backpack. If, just put it in your trash, because, it can attract animals to your campsite. Especially if you're in somewhere like California where it could attract bears, that's of course a hazard. And it just wasn't, it wasn't there to begin with. So it probably show.
Yeah. Okay, great. So clean up after yourself is really the sum.
Totally. Clean up after yourself. And there's too many trails that you see in Utah and there's just trash all over them. Makes me sad. Yeah. So yeah, it's sad.
Kind of question to that idea about maybe trash and just leaving no trace, kind of heads back to the idea of just respecting nature and staying interconnected with it. I think we've all been impacted or seen the tremendous effect that nature can have on our daily lives and change our behaviors. The fires in California, the typical poor weather sometimes we have in Utah. We had really strong winds this past week, over 100 miles an hour. So, just that relationship with nature, sometimes it reminds us maybe who's in charge. Can you talk about maybe what nature and the environment means to you from a relationship standpoint, and maybe benefiting you in the physical sense, the spiritual sense, emotionally? Like, how does it support you? Because we've talked about that on the show before, about how health is multifaceted and not just our physical health. Can you kind of speak on those other parts of health and how nature kind of helps you with that?
Yeah. So for me personally, I love being outside. I feel like it nourishes me. I feel connected to like kind of a broader sense of humanity when I do experience nature, because I get the sense of this is all of our responsibility to take care of this earth, to take care of these beautiful areas that we have. And it also kind of just can humble you, really. Like it, when you're out in the middle of nowhere and there's no one around, it reminds you kind of your own insignificance, which is really important for us to kind of have that dose of humility every once in a while. Like, we're running around in our busy day-to-day lives, thinking that we're so important, thinking that we have, all this stuff to be caring about. And sometimes I feel like it takes, a good camping trip or a good backpacking trip for me to kind of come back and say, okay, how important is it if I, get that, like extra, like blouse for work? Or like, how important is it if I, have the, the next best thing, or like the newest iPhone, like just thinking about being able to experience nature and having it feel like a communal kind of like activity, I think is humbling for me personally. And I guess a question I want to pose to you guys is, in the middle of our country's like reckoning over race and inequality, how can we make outdoor spaces more inclusive? Because it's very, a lot of information shows us that the people who are taking, these trips are people who might have the, opportunity to take PTO, people who have career type jobs. Like, maybe not your average day-to-day American can afford the $80 parks pass that you have to buy to, go to Zion, for instance. So how do you guys think we can like approach that problem, and how do you think we can make the outdoors more inclusive for everyone?
I really love that you brought that up. I was actually just about to ask about that, because there's one of our previous guests, our first guest that we had on, Mario, he talked a lot about outdoor education, especially in the youth. And I really think that that's a good place to start with that, because there's so much of our population, especially like inner city population, where they really never leave the city. The city is their home, and they don't get a lot of exposure to what nature is like. We don't get that ego opening feeling of being able to get out there, mostly because they don't have that privilege of being able to pack up and go. They have to feed themselves from day to day, much less try and take a recreational trip. So I think that the best way is probably to address a lot of those outdoor education in our youth, and really provide people the space, maybe grant programs for children, or grant programs for families who typically can't afford those types of things, or something like that.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, I think that's huge. And it's it's that racial inequality that's happening is starting to stand out so much more to people. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, any step in the right direction is going to be a good step in the right direction, because currently there's just not a lot happening for that type of inequality. So
Yeah,
I mean, it goes back to food insecurity and all of those things. So Devin,
Yeah.
what do you think?
When I think about it on maybe like a national country scale, I guess I get kind of depressed thinking about it, because it's such a big paradigm shift we're going to need to make to be inclusive to the entire country. Maybe in a more narrow sense within communities, I think that's where it starts. I live out in a community that has poverty, pockets of it. And one thing I noticed in differences between maybe higher economic counties or cities is that they have parks, they have outdoor, they have space carved out where they didn't develop housing. They didn't put a new mall, they didn't put a big parking lot and industrial type of things. So instead of like taking that big leap and taking people out of their element to put them in the wilderness, maybe kind of bring that to them. Part of the racial inequality that we see, and I just learned about this recently, is environmental racism. So where we put these communities don't have access to clean water. I live in Rose Park, and the stream that runs through it isn't very clean. It doesn't smell very good. We're next to the airport, so it's very loud. We don't get a lot of wildlife. So kind of looking at where we place these communities who are affected most and marginalized, and trying to bring some of the benefits we see of the environment to them, could be a big step in your local community.
Yeah, I love that idea of starting local and thinking locally before you say, oh, we have to, let's take the kids on a school field trip to, XYZ. Like, let's make, let's build a park there. Let's have some, kind of riverside, natural area that we have reserved for, no development, just kind of beautifying those spaces. I think that's a really important point, because, I'm in Salt Lake, and we have awesome parks here. Like we're a city with a lot of wealth and a lot of resources. So you look at Liberty Park, you look at Pioneer Park, and there's like seriously probably thousands of people are visiting those parks every day. They're highly utilized. So we know if we put parks in communities where people feel safe, and they feel like, I can go here and run around the park, or I can go here and go on a bike ride with my friends and catch up, people will utilize those spaces. So I really like that idea of starting local. And I also love, Cole, your ideas of kind of trying to implement some of that, like outdoor education and outdoor exposure in our public schools. I think those are both great ideas.
Yeah, one thing that kind of struck me, that when you were talking about, the utilization of parks, and Davin, when you mentioned bringing these park spaces to some of the city, one thing that one of our guests, Mario, had talked about was like city planning, and how important that is in the mental health of its citizens. But also that's something that us in the United States, we have the opportunity to capitalize on. We have more parkland in not just the United States, but North America in general. Canada included, has more parkland available to its citizens than the large portion of Europe, especially most of old Europe. There's I just think about the types of the types of things that Europeans, maybe in France or in Spain, they get to see the types of nature that they get to experience is so much different than the type of nature that we can see, oftentimes just going 30 minutes outside of our city. It's funny, one of our friends, my wife's a grad student, and one of her friends in her PhD program, they drove from, I believe his name is Stanimir. I can't remember what part of Europe he's from. But anyways, the particular country that he's from, every 20 minutes there's a town. Every 30 minutes there's a city or something like that. So you're never really alone. And he was driving from Spokane, Washington, the east side of Washington, over to Seattle. And in between Spokane and Seattle, there's not a lot. There's mostly trees. There's a lot of wheat, and that's about it. And he was baffled by the fact that 30 minutes outside of town, he had no more cell service. He's like, I've never experienced this in my whole life. He's like, my entire life, I've always had cell service. And that's something that struck me as being so huge. And it's important in this conversation because we have this opportunity, but we're really not doing anything about it. And so anyways, that's just a point.
Yeah, I think city planning is a huge thing. Like, where, okay, how far, are we going to have proper infrastructure? Like, there's people in Utah that don't have running water, and it's 2020. Like, if we don't have running water, if we don't have self-service, if we don't have those basic needs, how are we going to say, okay, cool, like, let's go on a camping trip? Like, if that's your situation, your priorities are driving, X number of miles to the nearest town to get potable water for your house. So I think that this 2020 has brought to the surface a lot of issues. Environmental racism, I think, was a new word for me, and I see it now, like, everywhere I go. I mean, it makes sense. And it's been a very interesting thing for me to learn about. And I'm, I've enjoyed educating myself about that concept, and having these kind of conversations where we can talk about, like, okay, what are some things we could do to combat this, is important.
So we've mentioned some things that we can do maybe at the political level or the city level or things like that require quite a bit of effort. Is there anything that you've thought about that us as individuals can do to kind of help with this issue?
Lobbying your Congress members, I think, is always important. That's kind of how, that's how we see those big systemic level changes, is typically through like either local legislature or kind of statewide or even national legislature. So making sure that your representatives are aware that, environmental issues are of concern to the people that live in their constituency. I think that's always important. And I guess just like advocating for a wider acceptance. So this was a really interesting thing. So I'm a big skier as well as a hiker and backpacker. And in the wake of the current, like, Black Lives Matter movement, I've been seeing a lot of really interesting conversations being held about the skiing community, which is overwhelmingly very white and very privileged community of individuals, because it takes a lot of money to go skiing. Day passes are, at this point, about $100 a day. If you want to rent skis, if you want to rent boots, you're looking at another $100. You need to also have snow pants, goggles, helmet. It's very expensive sport to be involved in. And there's kind of this, like, there's this joke in the ski community. I don't know if you've heard about, I'm sure you've heard about this, but, like, calling someone a Jerry. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
No.
Like,
I've heard it once.
Yeah. Or have you heard the phrase Trump skis and jeans?
I've heard that.
So there's, like, this joke in the ski community that, like, people who show up to this ski hill with jeans on, like, they're total dorks, like, they're losers, like, they suck at skiing, they're skiing in jeans, like, let's all laugh at them. And, I think that's that's obviously very problematic. Like, we have to look at that and say, like, okay, why is this person wearing jeans? do you think that it's because they think it's the warmest option? Probably not. It's more likely because they might not have the funds to afford, you know, the $100-$200 snow pants that you have on. And so I think shifting the way that we treat other people when we are in outdoor situations, I think can also have an impact. Let's say there's someone who's, you know, skiing for the first time, you know, they spent a lot of money on their day tickets, but they're really excited to go. They have jeans and a hat on and some sunglasses because they can't afford goggles, they can't afford a helmet. If they get into the lift line and they hear the people behind them laughing at them and calling them, you know, oh, she's a Jerry, you know, he's Jerry, like, look at that guy skiing in jeans, what a loser. It's not going to encourage them to embrace the outdoors. It's going to push them farther away. And I think that's dangerous because, you know, like you guys have talked about, we know the benefits that being outside can have on your mental health and wellness. So when we push people away by having those kind of judgmental classist attitudes, it can really be hurtful to a group of people who are trying to experience outdoors. And I think everyone needs to be a little bit more conscious of that. So making a comment on someone's gear, like, oh, nice backpack, you know, oh, nice skis, you know, trying to, like, you know, check yourself before you make those judgments and think about, why might this person, you know, why might they be skiing in jeans? Like, let's think about that, like, from, you know, from a non-judgmental point of view. Let's think about it rationally. Like, why might they be having that experience? So, and just having empathy. I think we in the United States just need to have more empathy for our fellow citizens and less us and them and more everyone together. I think that's a huge problem in today's society. So
it's such an interrelated topic too, because one way that people can experience this idea of being empathetic towards others, just the same way that you mentioned earlier, that like you feel this sense of connection by being in the outdoors.
Yeah.
It kind of helps you open up. You know, it probably would help a lot of other people open up in the same way, but then those same people might not have the opportunity to do it. It's this big feedback loop that we've created.
Right.
Very frustrating.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. Very vicious cycle.
I think that us and them gets reinforced at a young age too. There's stigmas from each group that look at maybe one another. I'm not sure if you guys ever watched that movie from Disney Channel, Johnny Tsunami. Have you ever seen that?
I love that movie.
So I'm from Hawaii, so that one holds a little bit deeper for me. But yeah, that's kind of, you know, stigmatizing skiers versus snowboarders and maybe some racial implications between the two. And for me, I always thought, yeah, like I'm a minority, so therefore I should like snowboarding, and then skiing's for these other people who are private school kids or whatever the case was. That was what the movie exemplified. So I think breaking down those stigmas, especially when you start to think about the outdoors, you know, oh, they're like nature people, they're tree huggers, like breaking down these old stigmas that people used to have about city versus people who are in the outdoors, and kind of just writing those off, I guess, and displacing those with some other more modern narratives that are more true and inclusive.
Yeah, totally. I think 2020 has been so much just, let's think about, like, okay, let's redefine kind of our thought patterns. Like, let's actually look at, okay, I might have had this like snap judgment, like, let's reassess that. Is that true? Is that real? Are there some other things going on that you don't know about? Probably. So I think that's always important, to just not stereotype people and not make assumptions about people based on, you know, maybe their ability or their fear or their experience in the outdoors and just in general. So
yeah, I mean, that's our goal here on the podcast as well. I mean, it's called The Different Perspective because we want to be able to provide people these exact points that you're talking about. So we're really excited that you brought some of these things up. It's
like nothing you talk about in 2020 will not get linked back to just these insane problems and questions that we're struggling with as a country right now. I feel like all of my conversations just end up, you know, I could be talking about the weather and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, you know, like the fires, and it's like climate change, politics, Republicans, Democrats. It feels very polarized right now. And it's a challenging time, but important that we go through this as a country, I think. So,
yeah. Turmoil is a good thing.
Yes. it's a catalyst for change, hopefully.
So I kind of want to switch gears here just a little bit real quick. You were talking about skiing. I'm assuming that's one of your other recreational activities you really enjoy. You said you moved to Utah specifically for the skiing.
Pretty much, yeah.
Are there other outdoor activities you like? I mean, do you play any like recreational sports?
Yeah, I mean, I could, say that I moved to Utah for other reasons, but when it comes down to it, I was pretty hyped on the skiing. I moved to University of Vermont because it was kind of like closer to Michigan, and they had a really good nutrition program, and I was like, okay. So I started skiing in Michigan, so that's like 800 vertical feet, little baby hill, and then up to Vermont. Still, like, we've had mountains there, but they're not very tall. And then Utah is just like, in my opinion, some of the best skiing in the United States. So I've totally hit the jackpot now. Other outdoor things I like to do. I love like competitive sports. Like, I get really competitive sometimes, and I'm surprised because I'm not even, I'm not that good at soccer or anything. My friends and we joined, I don't know, it's there's this like kind of like adult league club that you can join in Salt Lake, and they have a bunch of different options, and my friends and I signed up to be on a soccer team, and don't want to toot my own horn, but we ended up winning the championship. That was so
Nice.
fun. We've been playing a ton of beach volleyball this summer. With COVID and everything, we're trying to find activities where we can be outside and be distanced and still get together and have fun. And so beach volleyball has been really awesome for us. We've been playing beach volleyball like twice a week for like June and July and August. And we've just found there's courts around town that you can go for free. All you have to do is buy a ball and a net. So that's been a really great way to recreate. I would say those are really my main activities. If I lived in a more tropical, warm place that had access to water, I would probably like be interested in getting into surfing. I know that it's a really hard sport to get into. I've only tried it once, but I had so much fun. So that's like eventually one day I want to like try to get into that a little bit more. But for now, kind of mostly just doing like camping, backpacking, and then playing volleyball every once in a while. So yeah.
It's smart finding activities you can do socially distanced.
Yes. And things that you don't have to go like on a trip to do, you know what I mean? It's to just be able to say like, okay, it's Thursday night at 7:00, like let's go play volleyball for a couple hours before it gets dark. That's just like always good to have a couple things that you can do that aren't too far away from home, that don't require a whole lot of effort, just to keep you active and keep you outside is always important. So yeah.
I'm worried for when the winter comes, when all these outdoor activities I do now become really difficult. I'm not a skier by any means, so I'm gonna have to find some other activities to fill my time.
The big question is it going to be safe, to do some of these like indoor activities, like, skiing I can do outside and feel pretty good about, but can I go and play indoor soccer this winter? Like, I don't know if I'm going to feel comfortable with that, just with all that's happening with coronavirus. So I'm definitely worried. I am worried for this winter. I think when people start coming inside, breathing the same air, I'm worried about that. I'm curious. So since you guys are so in the fitness scene, like, do we know, is coronavirus being spread in gyms? Do we know that?
So personally, a little bit up here. So Pullman, actually, the town I'm in right now, actually just hit #1 in the United States for number of cases like developing.
Oh no.
It's so horrible, but not a lot of it's actually happening in the gyms. And I think that the reason why was because when coronavirus first became an issue, everybody was like, gyms are the worst place to be. That's where everyone's breathing hard. I mean, and it makes sense. Your respiratory rate's much higher. So when they closed them down, I think that everybody wanted to open them back up so bad that the gyms themselves cracked down on the idea of safety and cleaning protocols.
Yeah, strict protocol.
Yeah, strict protocols. One thing that fascinates me though is that there actually is a very low contact rate in terms of like touching the surface. it's almost impossible to get COVID by touching a surface that somebody else who has COVID has touched. It's almost exclusively respiratory.
Yeah.
And so the more data that we get, the more we realize that like places like gyms should be more dangerous. But so far in my experience, I haven't really seen a lot of cases coming through gyms. But you know, that's just anecdotal.
Yeah. Davin, what have you heard about gyms and the safety?
Yeah, so I've exercised here and there in a couple gyms. I think the way, at least weightlifting gyms are set up, they're inherently spaced out for the safety component regardless.
Right.
So I think everyone has this hyper consciousness about spatial awareness to other people, even before the pandemic. So I think that's a good contributor to why maybe it hasn't been as high in those spaces. In other types of gyms, like where spacing isn't as good, so like training martial arts, where that's a contact sport, there's definitely potential for more transmissions because you're face to face with somebody, and it'd be interesting to see the data out of those places because there's no way you can social distance a contact sport, and a lot of gyms that I've known had to shut down because there's just no way you can do it.
Yeah. So my question to you is, one of the other things I like to do is rock climb, but I'm kind of a newbie in it. So I really only feel comfortable going to the indoor gym. I don't like going outside. So the gym that I usually would go to, my membership's on pause right now because I'm just not super comfortable. They say, you know, you have to wear your mask when you walk in and when you're walking around, but when you're climbing, you can take it off. And I'm like, doesn't that defeat the purpose? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, if you were in my situation, would you go? Would you not? Like, I'm kind of torn because, like you mentioned, Davin, I'm worried for this winter when I'm going to go crazy. Like when I can, you know, when I'm only going to work and going to my house because, you know, can't go to concerts, can't do the normal thing. So what would your advice in that situation be? Would you go? Would you feel comfortable?
I think for me personally, there's not enough research and data to support maybe that step. Like even when I do work out around other people, the science says you can take off your mask when you're doing strenuous exercise. But I keep mine on, and it can be very difficult to do so. I think Cole might have a little more insight, but I'm just waiting for more data to come out in my decision. And if you don't feel comfortable, over time, I think you'll get a better answer from research.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on the activity. I think that in rock climbing, if you're up on a wall and you take your mask off, it's probably not as big of a deal just because from a dispersion standpoint, you're already kind of up near the rafters and things like that.
Right.
The air that you're breathing is going to be dispersing so much. But at the same time, it's more of like a time gated thing where the longer you're in an area, the more likely you are to breathe somebody's air. They could be on the other side of the room, and within 30 minutes, you could have breathed that same air that they breathed. So, I mean, I think that at this point, it's just assessing the personal risk. So, I mean, I think that it's appropriate that you say, well, I'm not comfortable with that. And, you know, I kind of wish that more people would say that as well. But the other side of it is that it's interesting the way that we utilize masks, because a lot of people use cloth masks. And there's actually some research coming out. I was just talking with a doctor the other day, and he's actually a world-renowned triathlon surgeon for triathletes. He was an Olympic orthopedic surgeon for a long time, and he was actually saying that cloth masks don't work. And that was really interesting to hear because we see all of this data being shown on the web about like there's like a 75% transmission drop between all these masks, but it's really only certain types of masks. Because a cloth mask, he was basically saying, you know, those like surgical masks that you probably wear whenever you go into a hospital or something like that. Those surgical masks work because it provides resistance coming in and resistance breathing out. But if there's no resistance and you're able to breathe comfortably, the mask isn't working, which is something that nobody wants to hear because
you have to be uncomfortable to be safe. No one wants to do that.
The safety's a little bit uncomfortable. It's like wearing a helmet. No kid wants to wear a helmet because it's uncomfortable, myself included. But so it's just this balance between like the fact that we're being exposed no matter what to to strangers air, and we have no idea what it could be. And if they allow it, I mean, I think if you're doing strenuous activity with a mask on or without it, you're going to end up breathing it one way or the other. So
Right.
taking the mask off isn't going to make a difference. That's just my opinion. And
Sad truth. Sad truth.
The sad truth. Yeah. So, I mean, if you have an opportunity to go outside and perform those same activities, I mean, there's all sorts, just my university itself is doing all sorts of Zoom online classes that you can do in the safety of your own home and still have some kind of community aspect. There's all sorts of those things. I don't know about rock climbing, but those types of things exist, and there are ways to get activity in.
Totally.
In a social distance electronic era. So
yeah, I think that's definitely been a big takeaway from the pandemic is like, okay, we can work from home like pretty successfully. Like we can have these meetings online. Like, like us three, like, I don't know if we would have been, Davin, when did you guys start this podcast? Was it pre or post pandemic?
Post.
Post.
Yeah.
I just wonder, would you have started this without the pandemic? Because usually you think about a podcast and you're like, oh, you have to have a studio and you have to interview someone in person. And now it's like, you can actually just do all this online, and it saves gas money and it's like more convenient for everyone because you can just be in your own house. So I think that's been like one of the positive takeaways. I don't want to say this pandemic's like a good thing or anything, but one of the positive takeaways is I think we've learned as a society, like, oh, we can get a lot done without having to meet face to face. That's been an interesting thing. I think a lot of people have realized.
Is not necessary.
Yeah.
Totally.
So I like to ask this. We're kind of coming towards the end of the time that we got with you, but I just wanted to ask, because I always ask everybody, what kind of books are you reading these days?
I love this question because I am an avid reader. I call it free reading, like as if I was still in school. So like when you're in school, you're like, oh, I have to read. And that's like your microbiology textbook. But so I would always refer to like my fun books as like my free reading.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the genre of magical realism. Does that ring a bell? Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
I love magic and fantasy, but I've never heard of magical realism.
Davin, do you know?
Neither have I.
Okay, so magical realism is like is this kind of genre of literature that comes out of Mexico, Central, and Latin America, and it's kind of the concept that like there was magic in the world at one point, and it still lives in some of those places. So like, for example, the three magical realism books that I have recently read have been Like Water for Chocolate, and that is a really good book if you're a foodie. It's about the life of a woman who's living in Mexico, and I can't remember the exact time period, but it was definitely like in the, quote unquote olden days, like before running water, before electricity, that kind of stuff. So and she is a cook, and one of the, just to like kind of give an example of magical realism, she's really upset and crying during one of the meals she's preparing. And when it's served to her family, everyone bursts out in tears and they're just lamenting. And it's like, the spirit of sorrow has like overtaken their bodies, and they, are just beside themselves weeping. So that's like kind of an example of magical realism. Usually spirits are involved, like dead people aren't always dead. They can come back and talk to you like as if they were real. There's a lot of characters in the books that can talk to the dead people. They see dead people. So Like Water for Chocolate, love that book. The House of the Spirits is another one that takes place in Chile. That was really good and very interesting to read at this time in America, because there was some really dark foreshadowing of the kind of like basically what happened to Chile's democracy, and as it kind of crumbled to a dictatorship. And I feel a little like, oh, that like really made me a little nervous just hearing about how their election started to get called into, you know, like kind of called into question, and, you know, kind of the slippery slope to authoritative dictatorship. It was very interesting to read, especially at this point in our country's history. And then the book I'm reading right now is 100 Days of Solitude. And that's another really awesome piece of literature based in Colombia, and just really, really beautiful, beautiful book, beautiful writing. So I'm just kind of a book nerd. I get really addicted to like a certain type of literature. So I'll do like 5 historical fictions, and then I'll do 5 like, you know, feminist sci-fis, and then I'll go to like magical realism. So it's kind of this, I'm always reading different books, and I'd love to know what you guys are reading, because I always am looking for recommendations. So.
Well, I'll always recommend the book, The Alchemist. Have you ever read The Alchemist?
No, but I've had multiple people tell me to read that. It's kind of a classic, right?
Definitely read it.
It's such a beautiful book. Like I can't even say, I mean, being a bookie, you'll probably get through it in a day, you know, and
easy.
I'm a pretty slow reader, and it, you know, it only took me a few hours to actually get through the whole book. It's, you know, it's small, but it's this beautiful story. The author's Paul Coelho. I can't remember. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but South American. And yeah, it's just, it just really is an incredible book. And it's just such a, like a sort of like we build our own destiny. We kind of shape our own legend kind of thing. It's self-helpy in a very beautifully told story. So
I like that, because I personally don't love the self-help books. Those are hard for me to read, and hard for me to, I really just, I like fiction. I like a story. You know, I don't like being told about, you know, how to improve myself. I want to be taken away from myself when I read personally.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Sure.
What about you, Davin? What are you reading?
So I'm reading 2 books right now. The first one, I think it's called a Native American History of the United States. So it's from that perspective. And that's a pretty thick book, and it's going to take me quite some time. But I think it's an interesting perspective that we don't often hear about the Native people to North America, and how rich their history is, and how developed their country was before colonizers came. And it's so amazing to see how developed they were. And maybe in our education we were told like, oh, there were just these people hanging out, and then colonizers came, and then it got awesome. It's like a very different story and perspective from where they come from. And just interesting to see how they've spanned the entire country. Like in Utah, it almost seems uninhabitable to live out here, but they have tribes who've lived here forever, and it's pretty amazing. Yeah. The other book I'm reading is All the Light We Cannot See. I think that's what it's called. I'm like just got into it, like 500-page plus book, so it'll take me some time again. But I always try to pick up fiction and nonfiction and jump back and forth.
I like that. Kind of like one that's more of like a story, and one that's a little bit more educational. That's a good strategy. If I
read nonfiction before I go to bed, I'm not sleeping. There's no way.
Oh, not me. That's what puts me to sleep. I would read nonfiction before bed. Have you ever read any of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan?
No.
If you like high fantasy, it is high fantasy. And one thing that I was interested in the magical realism, because I like that idea of like old magic and all of that.
Yes.
And in one way, I really like seeing the way that authors can construct different types of magic. I'm really interested in like the mechanisms of magic, because I really think that magic is just science we don't understand yet. And I think that there are things that we can learn that look like magic, but in this book there's like actual magic. And anyways, it's just this whole, it's a 14-book series. Wow. Absolutely gigantic. Robert Jordan built this universe that's as big as Lord of the Rings, if not bigger. And yeah, so if you're ever looking for a high fantasy book, Wheel of Time is a great series.
That's good to know, because yeah, I do love fantasy and sci-fi for sure. Read all the Lord of the Rings, I read all the Harry Potters, all of the Game of Thrones, so I'm kind of a fantasy nerd.
Then you'll definitely like Robert Jordan. He's a good writer. He's very verbose. He talks a lot, And then, have you ever read any of Brandon Sanderson's books?
I don't think so.
I can't remember the mists of. Anyway, so Robert Jordan wrote for these first 11 books, and then Brandon Sanderson took over for the last 3 books. So there's a little bit of a different writing style towards the end. Some people like the last 3 books better because he is less descriptive and more action-based. But yeah, it's a good series.
Nice. That's good to know. I'll have to look into that.
So it looks like we only have a couple minutes left. So Maddie, do you have any other questions for us? Davin, do you have any questions?
Just our normal wrap up if you don't have any others.
Let's see. Okay, we already talked about that. I guess my only outdoor cooking question for you guys would be, have you ever tried cooking over the fire outside, and how did it go?
Poorly.
Yeah.
I cooked some soup. That went okay.
From a can? In a can?
Can, yeah. But we cooked, we tried to bring some steak out. And we didn't really have like a cast iron grill or anything like that. So we ended up cooking it on top of a rock. And it was edible. We heated the rock up and then cooked it on top of that. And yeah, it was edible, but it was not a great steak.
Not amazing. Yeah. What about you, Davin?
I can't say I have them about that burner life, but once it starts to cool off and I don't think I'm gonna start any fires, maybe I'll give it a shot and give you the rundown.
It's challenging. I love asking people that question because it's like, I don't know anyone that like can do it well. You know what I mean? It's like, it's so hard to control a fire. Like you can control your burner on your, on your gas stove, but it's really like, I've had some just really disasters like in the fire. Like I tried to make these pizza subs that I saw on Pinterest one day. I was really excited. I was like, ooh, pizza subs. I've never made that. Like, so we made a fire for dinner and wrapped the pizza subs up in tin foil. And it was just, like a hoagie roll with pepperoni, pizza sauce, cheese, pepperoni, and then garlic, vegetables would be like or peppers and onions, and then you wrap it in tin foil, and then we were like, okay, so we just put it in the fire now, I guess. And we didn't really put it in the embers. Like I think you're kind of supposed to put stuff in the embers. We didn't put it in the embers. We put it just like in the fire, and we left them in for way too long. But you can't tell because you can't open up the tin foil and look at how they're doing. Yeah. And we took them out probably like 10 minutes later, like way too long. They should have been in there for like a couple minutes. We took them out like 10 minutes later, and there's the hoagie is just black. It's just charred. It was horrible. And we ended up, but what was cool is that totally like sizzled the pepperoni. Like the pepperoni was perfect, and the onions and the peppers were like caramelized. So we just ended up using like a spoon and like scraping out the inside of the hoagie and like eating that. But it was a really sad dinner because that's not a lot of food, like a couple pieces of pepperoni. So that was definitely a fail. Camping fail, which happens to the best of us. Yeah. Every once in a while.
Nice. Well, yeah, I think with that we'll probably wrap it up. So Maddie, we really appreciate you being on. We got to talk about quite a few things, so thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, nice. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Where can people find you, maybe on social media, or get in contact with you if they have more questions or want to follow up?
Yes, good question. So I would say just find me on Instagram if you have Instagram. I just started a backpacking meal kind of inspiration nutrition page, and it's at the Backpack Dietitian. No spaces or anything like that. Or you can reach out via email. Let's see, I have so many emails now. I don't know about you guys, but I have like a school email, I have like a work email, I have like 3 personal emails. So the easiest would probably just be like maddiefrench@comcast.net. So MADDIE French FRENCH@comcast.net. That's the easiest one to spell. So
yeah, we'll definitely post that for all the listeners. We will have that stuff in the description. You can go visit her page, check it out. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much, guys. This was awesome. I love talking to you guys. I thought, such a good conversation, important conversation to be had for sure. So thank you so much for interviewing. So fun. My first
thanks for being on.
podcast. Yay! I told Davin it's like my dream to be on NPR one day. So this was like a very good stepping stone.
One of these days.
Yes. Cool, guys. Well, I'm going to skedaddle to my gardening volunteering. So I'll see you later.
Awesome. Enjoy it.
See ya.
All right. Bye.